Good morning, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. So we're going to get started now. My name is Christine Newman Ortiz. I'm from Voces de la Frontera from Wisconsin. I want to share some good news with all of you this morning from Milwaukee. Milwaukee won a city-county ID, so it'll make it the 14th city in the country with an ID for all people, including the undocumented, underdocumented, and transgender. And just that local victory also exemplifies the importance of this NIIC conference, because that victory was inspired both by the need in the community, but also by seeing other examples of work being done around the country. And that's what's so great about the NIIC conference, that it provides a space for the immigrant refugee rights movement to come together to talk about good practices, where we are in this moment, and how we continue to advance immigrant and refugee rights. And to lead us in this morning's plenary conversation, I just want to introduce Maria Rodriguez. She's the executive director of the Florida Immigrant Rights Coalition. And it's been an honor to work with Maria for over 10 years in the capacity both in firm and NPNA. She's a fearless champion for immigrant, low-wage workers and their families. And she's always maintained a very strong vision of building a broad-based, multiracial, multi-ethnic movement that challenges all forms of discrimination. Under her leadership at FLIC, FLIC has built that kind of broad-based movement to challenge wage theft. Miami-Dade became the first county in the nation to do so, beating back an Arizona copycat law, raising the voice of dreamers nationally, and running effective and powerful GOTV operations. Please join me in welcoming Maria Rodriguez.
Thank you, Christine. We have come this far, we won't turn around. We'll fill the streets with justice, we are freedom bound. As you can see, I'm not a singer, but I push myself to challenge, because for the next hour, I think what we'd like to do is to challenge ourselves to go beyond integration to full inclusion and, dare we say, transformation. And we here stand behind a banner of opportunity, equality, and justice. And if we're not on purpose, then we're squandering our talents and our time. So hopefully the conversation today will challenge you to go beyond your maybe perhaps professional roles, to tap into your purpose and your passion so that we can transform and look at social justice as a key outcome of the work that we do. We have a distinguished panel here, really privileged. Before we start the conversation, I'm going to take a few minutes just to lay out some basic, concepts. On the way to the hotel, we passed, I took a picture of it and put it on my Instagram feed, Abolitionist Place. And I was curious about it just briefly, and it's a couple blocks away from here, 227 Abolitionist Place. And it turns out that it was one of the safe houses of the Underground Railroad, a couple blocks away, during the time that New Yorkers supported slavery. It's hard to imagine that that's a reality, or that that was a reality. But it's people like us in this room that look at not what is, but what could be, what's possible. And as an organizer, but not just organizers, anybody, whether you're leading an institution of higher learning or in municipal government or at a bank or wherever, I think it's our challenge to be on purpose to use our resources and our privilege, be cognizant of that, to go to what is possible. So what we say is we make the possible inevitable and the impossible possible. And although sometimes it seems like magic, it really is just hard work, and we do it day by day. So hopefully in the next hour, we'll look at how we can have integration that challenge us to do a radical vision of inclusion, where those most directly affected become protagonists, not just in their own liberation, but in the transformation of systems and culture, so that we can achieve these ideals that we hold true. There's also questions of intersectionality. Raise your hand if you know what intersectionality refers to. So I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner, but intersectionality refers to the multitude identities that we hold. Latina, mother, ED, bisexual, worker, whatever it is, these identities that you might hold, we are not single-storied. We're not just one identity. We are multiple identities. And when we look at intersectionality, we look at the complexity of our identities and the ecology in which we work. Because if you are helping a young person access college, there's no way you can't address issues of poverty. Or if you are helping a woman in her trajectory in the workforce, you may have to address the issue of violence. So intersectionality commands us to look at deeper, not symptoms, but systems. And I think that that's a concept that hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss a little bit more. And then the third concept is movement. And many of us are providing services, are supporting families, are managing institutions, and we may not consider ourselves part of a movement. And when we say movement, what we mean is individuals who are turned on to their purpose and seek courage to speak their truth to power. It means organizations that take on the challenge of radical inclusion and bringing in the diversity that exists in their communities. It means organizations that impact institutions so that they're more responsive to our public and common good. And it means culture, that we are in fact changing the hearts and minds, the narrative, our story. And as we move ourselves and our communities and our families from being subjects of history to protagonists of history, we're writing the story, and we do that day by day. And today we'll get a chance to speak to history makers, people who made history decades ago and people who are making history every day. And we all are making history. For those mathematicians in the room, a line is made up of an infinite number of points. We are all points in that line of history, and I challenge you to take on that role and to think about the abolitionists who are fighting slavery. What's the slavery of today that we need to dismantle? How will we find the courage to see not what is, but what is possible? So today, our two framing questions, our take-home points, in addition to encouraging you to be bold and courageous, to live up to these values of social justice, and it takes all of us, are one, what is a conceptual framework? What is the way that we connect immigrant integration as a movement, immigrant rights, into a broader social justice framework or movement? So that's the first question. And the second question, how do we put that into practice? What does that look like? Day to day, week by week, month by month, year by year. And hopefully we'll get some ideas from this distinguished panel. So without further ado, I would like to cue up a song, if it's there, that Bob Moses, who many are grateful to him for his historic role in the civil rights movement and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Since then, the founder of the Algebra Project, a MacArthur Fellow, and obviously still teaching, educating, and inspiring us towards action. If the song is ready, we'll take the song. If not, we can continue introducing the panel. We have Tia also. There it goes. Thank you.
Taken from an ancient land, suffered trial There's gotta be room for them, room for them. Right now we know you don't know how to save the circle. Let me tell you, Lord, lose your hold. There's gotta be room for all. The circle will break, man, if there's not room for all.
Testing. So that was Bernice Johnson Reagan. Bernice grew up in Albany, Georgia, in southwest Georgia, and sang for the Freedom Singers for SNCC, and then formed Sweet Honey in the Rock, right? So I like that song. It tells us that our circle here in this country, we need to keep making room for all the people who take this country as their home.
Thank you. I want to continue introducing the panel, and then I'm going to ask them, as a beginning question, a moment of where they've had to face courage, where they've had to go outside of their comfort zone to bring forward their voice. So that's the question. But let me introduce the panel. So Deepak Bhargava was not able to be here. I'm sorry, he's ill. And so we have Lenore Friedlander. She's an elected officer from 32BJ in strategic partnerships. 32BJ represents 150,000 workers throughout the country in 11 states. So thank you, Lenore. She's replacing Hector Figueroa, and we're really glad to have you here. Manuel Pastor from the University of Southern California. He's a regular here at NIIC, and has done tremendous research, writing, but also practice in relationship with community. So we thank you for that example of bridging that. And Tia also, an inspiration, a history maker in her own right with the Black Immigrant Network, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and we're really grateful to have you here, Tia. So chime in and share a moment where you've had to maybe face some fear, overcome courage, or muster up some courage. Would you like to share? This is talk show style, so you can just step up as you like.
So who will be courageous first? I want to start by saying, for those of you who don't know Bob Moses, his historic role in the civil rights movement, the way in which he faced racist violence in the South, and really challenged a whole generation of young people to show leadership in the Freedom Summer. So asking someone on the same panel as Bob Moses what their moment of courage was, which, you know, it sort of is like when I had to park my car very far away from a meeting and walk, you know, it's really terrible. But I want to kind of take it in a slightly different direction and tell a quick story, which is about a different kind of courage. When I was in graduate school, which is an incredibly heady experience, I used to play basketball to kind of get out of my head. And I played on the street. And it was in 1981. I was still trying to get my PhD. And it was the second year of the Gay Pride Parade in Northampton, Massachusetts. And the first year, there'd been some hassles. So friends asked me, I'm straight, to be one of the allies at this Gay Pride parade and be kind of a bodyguard for it. So I marched, and as I was marching through Northampton, this is 1981, much more homophobic era, it's sports, basketball, pretty homophobic too. Everybody I played basketball with was right over there as I was marching. And the next Monday, I went to the court again, and they looked at me and they said, "Well, are ya?" And I said, "What difference would it make?" And for a year, I played basketball as a gay ball player. Sort of the first Jason Collins of this world. And after about a year, I was doing a financial transaction with my wife at a bank. She must have been giving me money because she gave me a big kiss. And as I turned around, one of the ball players came up to me and hugged me and said, "You're straight, you're straight, you're straight." He was so thrilled. But for a year, they had to play as though there was a gay ball player on the court. They had to curb their homophobic comments. They had to act as though the other was in the room. And one of the things I think is really key about solidarity is, what do we do when the black organizer is not in the room? What do we do when the LGBT organizer is not in the room? How do we act as though the other is in the room and constantly demonstrate solidarity? So I'm not sure that was... That ain't Bob Moses level courage, but I mean, it's some, okay.
I'll share. So good morning, everyone. My name is Tia Oso. I'm the national organizer for Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And Maria asked me to talk about, showing a moment of courage and, not letting your voice be silenced. And earlier this summer, myself and a group of 50 Black organizers attending the Netroots Nation Progressive Organizing Conference interrupted the presidential town hall in order to make sure that the issue of state violence in Black communities was centered, and in particular state violence and police violence against Black women. When we decided to do the action, I had agreed to talk about Arizona and talk about what was going on in Black immigrant communities there. And then by the time we got into the conference hall, I would say, "Oh, Tia, you need to get a microphone." And I said, "Okay." And in stepping into the hall, and they said, they call it a town hall. So we all know how a town hall works. We organize town halls in our areas so immigrant voices can be lifted up in front of elected officials. And in the Phoenix Convention Center, there were no microphones to be found because they wanted us to present our questions online on social media. And so I had to think fast, because you don't let 50 Black organizers down, ever. Don't do that. And so when I saw Jose Antonio Vargas on the stage as the moderator, I said, well, he's an immigrant rights activist, I'm an immigrant rights activist. I bet if I can just talk to Jose Antonio and let him know what we're trying to do, he'll help me out. And so when we've never met each other before, there's all these kind of rumors and conspiracy about what happened. We do not know each other and have not seen each other since that day, ironically. And just making the decision to, number one, it's no small thing to decide that you're going to interrupt the proceedings of any, event in order to make your issue heard. It's not a small thing to interrupt and disrupt the status quo in society, but it's also not a small thing, a small condition that we're fighting against in our communities in the Black Lives Matter movement. And taking the decision and making the decision to follow through on what we knew had to be done in that moment took courage, but I don't consider myself to be courageous. I consider myself to be a freedom fighter and standing for truth, and I knew that that was what it would take at that moment. I knew that our voices needed to be heard. I knew that we definitely needed a microphone, because there are all different types of disruptions happening. Definitely shout out to the people who interrupted and disrupted yesterday during Hillary Clinton's speech yesterday. Yes, thank you, give it up. It takes a lot for directly affected people. There are people who have been in immigrant detention, doing hunger strikes, people right now who do not have status or are facing deportation, to be able to raise their voices and demand, to speak truth to power and demand that their issue is paid attention to. That is what it takes. And now, because of the action that we took, racial justice and police violence and criminal justice accountability is on every presidential candidate's platform. And it would not be had it not been for what we did that day.
It's interesting that disruption in technology is very hip, but disruption of a hegemonic political narrative, not so much.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll share a story, and it's really great to be here, and I'm going to be channeling Hector Figueroa, our president, who wished he could be here with everybody today. Our union, since its founding, has organized and represented workers that other unions didn't, and in our society do jobs that are often filled by immigrant workers, are very marginal jobs, whether it's home care workers or cleaners or security officers. And the call went out in our union, and our analysis was that it was really important for us to take our Justice for Janitors campaign to Houston, Texas, and into the heart of right to work, into a place where very few workers had come together and formed unions to improve their conditions. And so we challenged our members to join us in talking to the non-union cleaners who worked 4 hours a night cleaning office buildings, taking home $20 a night. And many of them traveled on a bus for an hour or 2 hours, had to pay the public transportation to go to work, take home $20, and so for a 4-hour shift, maybe it really took 8 hours, and people couldn't live on that, but there was a sense of futility and hopelessness, and what's the path forward here? High turnover, and so we went and took our energy and hope and thoughts for what it was going to take to make that change, and were successful together with other members from around the country in challenging workers and pushing them past their fear that if we come together and we stand up, we can improve our conditions. And so the office cleaners decided to go on strike. And as part of one of the solidarity actions to try to really create the crisis necessary for a citywide resolution, it came time to talk about what kind of public protest we were going to do, up to and including civil disobedience. And so many of the members from around the country, including our members, decided to participate in that protest and agreed to participate in nonviolent civil disobedience if that was necessary. And so I made the decision to participate in that civil disobedience and say that if our members are prepared to do that, then our staff and officers need to be right there with them. And had never been arrested in the South. It was very different than doing civil disobedience in Washington, D.C. or New York or Philadelphia, where you get a little ticket and you get released from the station and you pay a little fine, and sometimes it even goes away. Not so in Houston. And the power structure had a very different reaction, brought out police horses, challenged the group, and we sat down in the street. Some people got trampled by the horses. We were arrested and kept in jail for 3 days, and for blocking traffic, which is not the usual situation. And there was an incredible, our members really stepped up and rose to the occasion. It was pretty scary, and it was a very different kind of a situation, but we were able to stick together through that experience. The workers were successful, and when people, reflected on it, felt like that courage was something that helped give confidence to those thousands of office cleaners in Houston, Texas, to make a real difference in their life, and they have been successful in changing their lives. So.
Thank you. And, so important to especially bring the reality of workers who sometimes seem disposable or invisible and are so central to our economies, but also to our lives, and to visibilize that. At the citizenship clinics in Miami, we often tell volunteers, you're sitting across the table with somebody who you may not know their story. You may not know, if they came on a boat from Haiti, from Cuba, what they've had to go through to be at that table and actually sign an application for citizenship might mean the world to them. And so as we are working in communities, students, employees, clients, organizers, we have to understand that we all face different experiences, but that we really want to tap into that courage. Would you like to share, Bob?
So I was on the witness stand in Greenville, Mississippi, in the spring of 1963. We had been grease-gunned on the highway. Jimmy Travis had caught a bullet. A grease gun is sort of like a machine gun, right? And SNCC had converged on Greenwood in response, and LaFleur County had cut off the federal food allotments, and we used that. We raised food in Chicago. Dick Gregory flew down plane loads of food to Greenwood, and we told the people, look, the sharecroppers we were working with, the reason you don't have the food is because of politics, and so to get some of this food, we need you to go down and register. And so we got hundreds of sharecroppers who went down to register. 1963, Kennedy in the spring was still president. Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General. Burke Marshall was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. When we got hundreds of people going down, they arrested the SNCC workers, and Burke had our cases removed to the Federal District Court in Greenville. So we bussed over sharecroppers from Greenwood, and they were packed in the courtroom on the benches, standing along the walls, and Burke had sent John Doerr down to be our lawyer. The federal district judge, Judge Clayton, leaned over and he asked me one question: why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? So we said basically the country can't have its cake and eat it too. It can't have denied a whole people access to literacy through their politics and then turn around and say, well, you can't do politics because you're illiterate, right? So the point I'm making here is that the subtext of the right to vote was sharecropper illiteracy, that the country had been running what I call sharecropper education for 3/4 of a century since the Civil War. Sharecropper education means that you have a people who are pre-assigned a certain kind of work, and so they get the education for which they've been pre-assigned, right? Now, 400 Mexican-American students marched out of school in San Antonio 4 years later in 1968, demanding that they have better schools and better teachers. And their parents took their case into the court system, and it landed at the Supreme Court in a case called Rodriguez versus San Antonio. And the Chief Justice Powell told them, look, you can't really come to the federal court system for equity relief because there is no substantive constitutional right to an education in this country. So what I'm pointing out to us is that there are two big issues before us in the 21st century. One is we need an affirmative constitutional right to vote, and we also need to lift the education of all the children up to the level of the Constitution in this country.
So many people in the room, professionals from a variety of disciplines, et cetera, are wondering, how does immigrant rights link to social justice? And what are the frameworks or understandings of moving that forward? This panel is called Transformational Solidarity. Tia, would you like to share a little bit about that? And then the rest of the panelists, if you could share how you see the link between immigrant rights and a broader social justice movement.
Yes, so transformational solidarity is a framework that Baji brought together at the beginning of this year. Once there were so many, just the mass movement ignited by the Black Lives Matter movement of folks on the ground demanding justice and bringing attention to state violence against Black communities, we also noticed a complete kind of reluctance and a hesitation amongst many in the migrant rights community to participate and support. A lot of people, reached out to Baji and say, well, we don't know how to support, or what can we do? And then also, and this is after, incredible courage and demonstrations and mass civil disobedience and really pushing and challenging of the system by, young dreamers, right, in the immigrant rights movement. And so within Baji, we said, okay, well, we need to take a look at what it is that is dividing and siloing our communities and our movements. And so we put together a webinar and a talk called Transformational Solidarity, and introducing this concept of, solidarity is more than symbolic and transactional. Solidarity is about more than showing up. We need to be prepared to exhibit a solidarity that pushes us to get out of our silos, that pushes us to take risks for the liberation of one another. It's not just enough to have a diverse, multiracial demonstration. Do we have a multiracial movement where we fight for one another, where we say, I'm not going to take a compromise that throws my brother or my sister or my comrade under the bus? And so that is the concept and the framework that we created in order for folks to understand why it's important for the immigrant rights movement to show up for Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, and a movement that was created by 3 women, one of them a first-generation Nigerian immigrant, Opal Tometi. Black Lives Matter, a movement where Black immigrant folks are showing up and on the front lines every day. My cousins, Jemima and Kemi, good little, again, first-generation Nigerian girls, are risking arrest and taking arrest and civil disobedience actions at their colleges. Students who are here from Ghana and Trinidad and Tobago on student visas, putting their scholarships and their student visas on the line in demonstrations in California and New York, because we understand that, yes, I'm here and I have an opportunity, but I know that while one community is not free, or one sector of my community is not free, then none of us can really actually truly be free. And we need to be looking for ways to not just challenge the system, right, and reform the system, but really to transform the system in order to make and create this truly multiracial democracy with social and economic justice for all people, for all communities. And that's where we developed the concept from.
Yeah, thank you, Tia. I'd like to invite other panelists not just to share the conceptual framework, but in practice, how have you seen this integration work?
So I'll share from our perspective a little bit, thinking about the connection between immigrant justice and economic justice. And I would say a framing approach to this is seeing the struggle for immigrant rights and the rights of undocumented people as a justice issue. So that's kind of the first conceptual framework. This is a justice fight. This is a fight for freedom, for justice, and however we engage, whether we're a service provider or an academic or a business person or a labor union or community organization, that we're talking about changing the balance of power in this country, and we're think about who actually benefits when in the current system. And when we think about that, Occupy kind of brought this issue of the 1% and the 99% into the public consciousness to really focus on the increasing income inequality. And one of the ways that we experience the immigrant rights movement and the fights for of undocumented workers is it's a workplace issue. It's what are the kinds of jobs that immigrant and undocumented workers are doing? How is that work paid? How is that work valued? And part of our organizing is about changing that balance of power. And so much of the fight for immigrant rights, not all of it, but there's a huge identity as a fight for workplace dignity and respect and decent compensation. And the way that we hear immigrant workers who are organizing, who are office cleaners, who are airport workers, is I'm treated this way because I'm an immigrant. I can be super exploited. They can pay me less. These are some of the jobs that we have few opportunities for work, and we're concentrated in these occupations. And really proud of SEIU and our union that we have not shied away from organizing successfully immigrant workers, including undocumented workers. Workers have stood up, have gone on strike, whether in office buildings or at the airports, but really thinking about that connection and that frame around part of the cause and the persistence of the problem is because of the system of corporate greed or unregulated capitalism that we find ourselves in. And we see that capital is global, and the mistreatment and exploitation of workers is also global. And so that's a piece of it. There's also a connection to people seeing, because I am Latino or Asian or an immigrant, people experience how they're treated and see it through a racial lens sometimes as well. And so there's really a connection about the fight for workers' rights is also a fight for immigrant rights and a fight for racial justice. So I think, on the positive, the fight for 15 has sort of galvanized and created a sense that there is a political moment to say it's not about a fight for a quarter or 15 cents or a nickel, that we have to have the political courage to fight for the kind of change that's actually going to make a real significant difference in people's lives, and that has really taken hold. Encourage people to find ways to organize and support that for whatever groups of workers are organizing under that banner.
Yeah, and thank you, Lenore. And the history, the last century, was actually an immigrant movement that was a labor movement that won a lot of the protections that we enjoy today. And that movement also faced much of the xenophobia at that time. Europeans coming west, now it's the South coming north. But it's the immigrant rights movement that can also impact favorable labor laws, and we've seen that in the work and wage theft, for example. Manuel?
I was at a meeting about African American economic fortunes in the United States. It was actually facilitated by Gerald Lenoir, the former director of Baji. It's about 20 of the folks were African American, and a few of the rest of us. And Gerald began the meeting with an icebreaker, several-day meeting, that you should borrow, actually. It's a great icebreaker, and it's called Yo Mama Said. And it's like, what did your mother tell you that really sticks with you, right? And people had some great stories about the importance of education or family. The only thing I could think about with my mom, who grew up in Spanish Harlem, who cursed like a truck driver, but in Spanish, and at a very rapid rate, right? Was the one thing that just kind of came straight to my mind that my mom said was, you never cross a picket line. You never cross a picket line. And she was a labor supporter, to be sure. We were a union family. But she meant more than that, which is you stand in solidarity with other people. You don't cross when they're struggling for their rights. And I think that stuck with me, and it's also stuck in, we see a lot of work in particular in Los Angeles about black-brown unity, about African Americans and immigrants coming together, particularly in South LA, a place that in 1970 was 80% African American, and today is 2/3 Latino. So in the midst of that demographic transition, how do you build ties? And there's one way of building ties which is transactions based, which is let's make a deal. I wonder how we, as immigrants, can get Black Americans to support immigration reform. And then the other way to do it is transformational, which is working with our own people to understand something critical, which is that you're not going to get social justice in the United States unless the African American struggle for full equality is realized. That's been the bedrock. And unless we do work within our own communities to make sure that we realize that, and for African Americans, I always say just read The Warmth of Other Suns, that great book by Isabel Wilkerson about the Great Migration, and then understanding the role of immigrants becomes really clear. So transformational is about sort of not just, as you were saying, standing in solidarity, but really beginning to understand, embrace, and be part of the struggle for someone else's justice.
Our mutual interests, yeah. Bob, would you like to share where you're seeing the linkages and how we can foster and support them more?
So I think we have to think of the country in units of time which span 3/4 of a century. Because the country lurches forward and back, roughly speaking, in those units of time, at least it has so far. And if you think of the first unit of time from 1787 down to the War of the Constitutional People, the country carried two concepts which really clashed with each other. One is in the preamble, the idea of we the people. In that period of time, it was white men who owned property were the constitutional people per se. And then the second concept is in 423, Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. And that's the idea that we were also going to be a country that had constitutional property. So we tried to carry that forward, and finally it all came to an end in the War of the Constitutional People over their constitutional property, right? And we decided that we were going to be a country that would no longer have constitutional property. That was the 13th Amendment, right? But you have to Google Circular 3591. You can do it right now, but if you Google Circular 3591, what comes up is a missile, something that the Attorney General, Francis Biddle, sent to every state prosecuting Attorney General on December 12th, 1941, 5 days after Pearl Harbor. And what he told every state Attorney General was that they should no longer prosecute peonage as debt, but they should use the 13th Amendment. They should prosecute it as involuntary servitude or slavery. So what was that all about? It was about the fact that of really the idea of the undocumented in this country, right? The tens of thousands of young black men who were in essence undocumented in their own country, who were rounded up for vagrancy, for not having any money, and then put to work in the mines, right? So why did Roosevelt decide that he needed to change that? Well, 5 days earlier, on December 7th, we had Pearl Harbor, right? And Roosevelt now decided that he needed young black men, and he needed then to change the situation in this country. So we are here today in the third constitutional era, and quite frankly, whereas in the first constitutional era, young black men were not put in jail, you didn't prosecute your assets, right? You didn't put them in jail. In the second, you put them in jail and put them to work in the mines. In the third, you don't need them. There's no work at this point for them unless they have skills that access knowledge work. And so we're facing the situation now in this country in our third constitutional era where we have disposable people, right? On the issue of immigration, I do the algebra project, and we work with kids in the bottom quartile. So from 2006 to 2010, we were working at Edison High School in Miami. And at that time, Edison High School was Haitian Americans primarily. And I spent the 4 years following a group of Haitian American students from 9th grade through the 12th grade, getting them ready so that they could get into college and do math, college math for college credit. And of course, they had the problems, right, that you are talking about here. Did they have documentation? Did their parents have documentation? And so these problems, they're everywhere, right?
We just have a few minutes left, and I know if people could queue up the preamble to the Constitution on your phones to Google it. I don't know if we can share it, but I think Bob wanted for us to review that. So if somebody could queue it up on their phone, the preamble to the Constitution. And while we get somebody maybe on your phone to help us, just parting thoughts. What do you think? I mean, we've talked a little bit about courage and how it's not that we have to do civil disobedience or disrupt events, but every day we face opportunities to be on purpose and to use our courage. It might be just having to wake up. But that's the challenge for us, to really dig deep, considering what's at stake, and moving forward with courage. And I think we've also had an incredible privilege to learn a little bit about history. And when I feel so much trouble in the world, I think I go back to history and understand that that we will prevail and we shall prevail. So very quickly, in 30 seconds, parting thoughts around courage, history and transformation, and bringing social justice into the center of our work.
You're asking an academic to take 30 seconds. That's a great. So just a small thought first. Bob Moses, be deep, man, be deep. So 3 things quickly. One is, I think we need to make sure that we've got a big and broad vision as we move forward. Van Jones, a good friend of many of us, reminds us that when Martin Luther King marched on Washington, he did not, with everyone else, give a speech that said, I have an issue, right? It was, I have a dream. Too many of us have an issue. We don't have a big, broad dream about justice, equality, respect, and dignity that brings together all of these struggles. Second thing, Martin Luther King said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But somebody's got to bend it, right? And what that means is that we need to make sure that we've got the right kind of institutions and organizations to achieve this. Occupy Wall Street raised some really important issues, but it was a moment, not a movement, because it wasn't willing to put itself to work in terms of actually putting together the institutions that would make a difference. The final thing I would say is that we sometimes, when we talk about movement, think it's all on our side, like the movements are progressive. There is a vibrant, right-wing, nearly fascist movement bubbling up in the United States right now, captured by the candidacy of Donald Trump. That is a real, authentic, grassroots phenomena. And we are at our we run a big risk unless we take that seriously, understand it, understand how to combat it, and actually have a strategy. We wound up pushing for President Obama to get elected and not fully anticipating that the Tea Party would surge up and topple so much in the other direction. We need to anticipate this rise of the right.
So I think this is a great opportunity for us to be re-inspired and renewed and by the courage of dreamers and immigrants who are seeking a better life and seeking justice, to be inspired by the fierceness of the Black Lives Matter movement and really confronting some very deep structural racism, not just police abuse, but the whole system on how deeply racial prejudice and racial discrimination is embedded in our society, and to commit ourselves to think about building our movement by organizing and learning from the Fight for 15 and other campaigns where we are organizing a powerful movement that can speak up and think about ourselves as continuing to fight and win and dream of the kind of society that we all want to live in.
I'll echo both of my fellow panelists in saying that we need to be courageous in the way that we think about the opportunities and the possibilities of what it is that we're fighting for. Having organized in Arizona as well as on the national level, and hearing the conversations about the things that we're willing to compromise on and trade on, how we don't want to maybe link our issues to what's going on in the Muslim community, or how we don't want to link our issues maybe to what's happening to refugees and refugee rights, right? And not centering what's happening in African American communities and saying, you know, this is a new civil rights movement, instead of locating the immigrant rights movement on the continuum, right, and central of racial justice. I think that the challenge is that, yes, clap it up. The challenge that we have is also an opportunity. We have incredible power and incredible strength. And instead of looking at, you know, citizenship and full rights and freedoms and dignity for all people as something that we're asking someone to give us, our communities have earned this right. Our communities should be demanding this right. These are, you know, a matter of public policy and a piece of paper to be able to go and naturalize. And we act like we're asking for the moon and the stars, when actually our communities give their blood, sweat, and tears every day, right, in order to make America work. Every single day. The people who are serving us right now, who set up this room, who are cleaning our rooms right now, right, are immigrants and children of immigrants who have endured horrific, sometimes, journeys across oceans, across deserts, right, risking their lives, yes. And so it is on us, who call ourselves movement builders and policymakers and progressive and want to, you know, represent communities in any way, an elected office in all of these different ways. It is on us to represent them in the true fullness of what it is that we're asking for, because they're not asking for anything that we have not already earned the right to. And so my challenge is to all of us to see that we're not working at odds with one another, and let's not be pitted against one another, but let's really continue to understand how we can deepen and do our inner work and internal to our communities, and addressing our internal biases and anti-Blackness and homophobia, right, Islamophobia, all of these different things, to do that internal work so that we can build strong relationships and fight together, and together we'll be able to win.
Thank you. In Miami, we say, "We nu capab," which is Haitian Creole for "si se puede," and we have to believe that, yes, we can make those changes. And we've lived incredible times. We saw a dreamer nation awaken. We saw the Black Lives Matter movement sweep this country, from the congressional aides that came out to the universities, et cetera. We saw incredible courage of the trans visibility, trans pride movement, and an incredible time to recognize that we all fit in the circle. We've seen the hunger strikes in the detention centers, the movement against for-profit prisons, completely transforming the narrative. So I invite you, in your position of power, privilege, in your role of governance, in your role of protagonist of history to use whatever you can to help make these values true. And these movements, they are the real patriots of our country, defending the DNA of what this nation has had to overcome and aspires to be. And with that, we have the great honor to give a history maker, Bob Moses, the final word to this plenary.
So I'm going to ask us to do an enactment, and I'm going to ask Petra to come up and help us. So Petra and I did this at a meeting at ETS just a couple of weeks ago. The preamble to the Constitution, it doesn't say "we the citizens." And it couldn't say "we the president" or "we the Supreme Court" or "we the Congress" because they didn't exist. It could have said "we the citizens of the several states," and then we would be a very different country. So think about it. It just says "we the people." And to be truthful, all the people who put that together were also undocumented. So the preamble opens up a space for everybody who lives in this country and takes it as their home, documented or not. And so we have an opportunity then to use the preamble as a tool for our movement and for our democracy. What it requires is that we take it into ourselves and we decide that it's alive and we're going to own it. And you have to think not just what the preamble says, but what it does. It creates a class of people, the constitutional people. So everybody who lives in this country and who takes this country as their home can be welcomed into the constitutional conversation by the preamble. And so what I would like for us to do is to say it together. I will say it bit by bit, if you will repeat it. And after we finish saying it, I would like us to just have like a moment of silence to think about what we are doing, and then ask Petra to take us home. We, the people of the United States,
Can people stand?
in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So if we can just take that into ourselves for a moment and think not only what we have said, but what we are doing, and then Petra will take us home.
Well, good morning. I think the thought that I have right now is that we need to be grateful for the road, the journey of all organizers, all activists, all leaders who have been in the many movements in our history and our narrative, who have fought, given up their lives, their time, sacrificed family time, and to all of you here these last few days who have been thinking about the road ahead and that victory will come. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you and encourage you to check out the New Dreams campaign and agenda, which will help guide us forward as we pursue these ideals. Thank you so much, and thank you to the AV team and the organizers.